Welcome, everyone, to the On Poly podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, the government is proposing big changes to Ontario's Freedom of Information law. We'll have one of the reporters central to this story on to explain why this matters.
The Ford government has made a number of announcements about courts, crime, and law and order. We'll go over the details.
And we'll check in on Guelph, Niagara, Hamilton, and Toronto as we keep an eye on this year's municipal elections.
And in your column, my column, I'm going to talk about a new report out about the future of Sault Ste. Marie.
And I am going to talk about a by-election that's happening in Scarborough Southwest. That is, what do we say, JMM? The gift that keeps on giving.
Yes.
Boy, is that a juicy story.
It's March 20th, 2026, so let's get to it.
Hello, my friend.
Hello, sir.
Always some sugar to start with.
Yes, indeed.
Do you think people who are only listening to this but not watching it on television understand what's going on when I say that?
We have periodically explained that it's not like you're kissing me on the cheek or something, but yes.
Not that I would mind doing that, but just so people know. I mean, I am rather affectionate to you, but yes. We're just fist bumping because that's our little thing to start out with.
That's how we start off the podcast and start off our mornings.
Can I raise a little complaint with you now?
Okay.
As we go? Okay, I'm starting to see T-shirts repeating themselves, and I'm expressing my disappointment.
Well, I'll work on the T-shirt budget, but in the meantime, yes, this is my Axolotl Questions T-shirt, which I am wearing because we are going to discuss, as you mentioned in the intro, we're going to discuss the Freedom of Information changes, and I just remind people that axing a lot of questions is part of what we do and part of what all citizens can do.
110%. That's exactly right. Now, I feel in a way, the Oscars just happened this past weekend, right? So I feel like I should be saying, today I'm wearing Yves Saint Laurent, or today I'm wearing Givenchy. No, today I am wearing Leslie Frost. And I will stand a little bit just so people can see. There he is. That's actually, his nickname was Old Man Ontario, but that's a very young picture of Leslie Frost. He's not looking too old there. Why am I wearing Leslie Frost? Well, here we go. Here's my tortured logic for the day. It was 1 year ago yesterday that Doug Ford was sworn in for the third time as the Premier of Ontario. The last guy to win 3 straight majority governments, as Doug Ford has done, and everybody gets this wrong. I ask people this question all the time. Who's the last guy to win 3 straight majority governments? Who do you think the first person is that people guess?
The namesake of this studio, Bill Davis?
Correct. The first that everybody guesses Bill Davis. Yeah. Mr. Davis won 4 elections in a row, but of course had 2 minorities in the middle. So no, he's wrong. The second time people guess, they say Dalton McGuinty, who won 3 elections but was 1 seat short of a majority for the third one. No, the last guy to win 3 straight majority governments before Doug Ford was this guy, Leslie Frost, and you've got to go all the way back. This is a hard achievement. 1951, 1955, 1959. No disrespect intended to Doug Ford, because it is a huge accomplishment to win 3 straight majorities, but by 2 different, what do the statisticians say? Metrics?
Yes.
2 different metrics. Leslie Frost's record is a little bit better. Now let me just nerd out here for a second and I'll tell you why. Frost won his 3rd majority in 1959, which was Bill Davis's first election as a backbencher, incidentally. He got 72 seats in the legislature. Ford won his 3rd straight majority with 64% of the seats in the legislature. So Frost had a few more seats, a little bit more impressive. Frost captured 46% of that total vote in his 3rd election. Ford got 43%. So again, Frost a little better. But there is one head-to-head matchup where Doug Ford does better. Frost's total vote was the same in elections 1 and 2, and then down a few points in election number 3. Ford has increased his share of the total votes for 3 straight elections. He got 40.5% in election number 1, 40.8% in election number 2, and 43% in election number 3. So 3 straight elections where he increased the percentage of the vote. So, and I got to say, that is also a hell of an accomplishment, because the notion that you could actually be getting more popular as the years went on is really something worth noting. Yes. So there we go. That's why I'm wearing Frost and not Yves Saint Laurent.
Interesting, though, that Ford's absolute number of flesh and blood voters was highest in his first election in 2018. And both he and the opposition parties have subsequently lost votes in just the absolute count. And I think it's just worth reminding people that the 2018 election really was a very high turnout election by the standards of recent Ontario elections.
Now, usually at this point, after we've had our little chit-chat about nerdy Ontario political history stuff,
Yes.
we throw to issue one. But I want to just take a pause here to say that I have what we call the appearance of a conflict of interest on the subject that will make up issue one. I have a family member that works directly for the minister in question that you guys are going to talk about. So I will be absenting myself from the discussion, which you will have with someone who happily knows way more about this subject than I do anyway.
And me.
Yeah, he's pretty smart on this stuff. So I will see you for issue two.
Yes.
And in the meantime, here comes issue one.
Last Friday, the Ford government announced their intention to update Ontario's Freedom of Information and Privacy Protection Act, a 40-year-old law the government says badly needs updating. The catch? The government also wants to substantially restrict the public's access to some government documents the public currently still has the right to know about, at least for a little longer. Journalists have used Ontario's Freedom of Information law to break major stories, including the Greenbelt scandal, the controversy about the Ontario Science Centre, and even the sorry state of Ontario prisons. But journalists are not the only ones who use FIPA. This information is valuable to lawyers, researchers, and activists. Under the law as it stands, the right to these documents isn't just for reporters, it's for everyone. With more on these proposed changes, joining me in studio is Isaac Callan, journalist at Global News. Isaac, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just start off with the brass tacks here. What changes is the Ford government proposing to the province's current freedom of information framework?
Right, so the way it currently works is that anyone in Ontario who pays a $5 fee can access some of almost anything the government does. That is communications, presentations, data sets, slide decks, all sorts of things. Put in a written request and you get access to that information. Currently, everyone who works for the government from the premier down is subject to those laws. So things they write could be subject to that disclosure. What the government's doing is they're essentially putting a ring around some of the elected officials, the political side of government, essentially. So the premier, his cabinet ministers, his parliamentary assistants, and all of their staff will, if these changes go through, be shielded from those freedom of information requests. So journalists and advocates and other people will still be able to access written communications and all sorts of documents from civil servants. But when it comes to the actual decision makers and the politicians, their records, their communications, who they met with, things like that, that would all be shielded from the public.
And just to give people a sense of the scale here, 2 points here. One, this does mirror the federal freedom of information law. Reporters very, very frequently complain about the scope of the federal law, but also just the fact that it would include the premier, ministers, and parliamentary assistants. What we're functionally talking about is almost every elected progressive conservative MPP would be shielded by this law.
Almost every elected progressive conservative MPP and their staff, right? So
yes.
It's one thing to exclude the premier, for example, the decision maker, but it would include all of his directors of policy, all of his communication staff. So it's a very large number of people who are now going to be excluded from this act. It's not just the premier and his cabinet ministers when they're talking about things that happened in cabinet, for example.
So let's just go down the list of some of the controversies of this government where freedom of information laws have been, freedom of information requests rather, have been relevant. We could talk about the Therme Spa deal at Ontario Place, some of the government's changes to private health care, shutdown of the Science Centre, which I mentioned previously. You know, what do these changes mean in terms of breaking these kinds of stories and in terms of making that information public?
Okay, I'm going to take the Science Centre as an example because I think it's an easy one to understand. That this is a government who communicates very regularly but doesn't always tell you everything they're doing and why. So the Science Centre, if you cast your mind back, felt like this emergency announcement when they made it. It was a Friday before the long weekend. The government came out and said in a matter of hours they were going to be closing down the Science Centre. It wasn't a case of get your last visit in next week or having a closing ceremony or anything like that. They said the roof was essentially in such bad condition that the Science Centre had to be closed hours from the announcement.
There was a wedding that was cancelled.
There was a wedding that was cancelled. People had their events refunded, all sorts of things. What we were able to find out through freedom of information requests specifically to the minister's office was that it wasn't quite as urgent as the government had made out. Now, I'm not casting aspersions on the report. I'm just saying that records and communications showed that about 10 days before they made that announcement, the government knew about the roof's condition. They'd started planning it. They drafted the news release about 10 days before they made it public. So what that tells us, and what Freedom of Information requests were able to tell us, was that the government gave the impression that it was really urgent and had to shut the science centre down, a cynic would say, to coincide with the long weekend so that the news story was buried.
Yes.
And they could have made that decision a week earlier. They could probably have given it another week for people to say goodbye. It's not the biggest government policy by any means, but it just gives you an idea of why getting an idea of what decision makers said behind the scenes and when they knew certain bits of information is really important to our democracy, so that we can analyze whether the government is what the government is telling you, if it's the whole truth and if it's the full motivation as well.
Now, your employer, Global News, is a bit more directly involved in this whole file. Give us a bit of the story why Global in particular has been pursuing a specific bit of information.
So this goes back to 2022, the QP strike. My colleague Colin DeMello and I were watching Doug Ford's news conferences. This is when he tried to use the notwithstanding clause. There was essentially a threat of a general strike in Ontario, and the government then walked that back. One of the things that Doug Ford said at the news conference where he walked back the decision to use the notwithstanding clause was that he'd been on the phone all night. And it's been an open secret in politics for years that Doug Ford uses his personal cell phone, that he gives out his number to constituents, and that it's always been part of the Ford brand, right? So we decided it would be interesting to get an idea of who had been calling the Premier, right? Who was it who called the Premier over the week before the QP strike, who was able to so influence him that he decided to walk back using the notwithstanding clause? So we put in a Freedom of Information request for his personal cell phone and for his work cell phone. What we got back was the fact that the Premier hadn't used his work cell phone, period. For the period of time, he just had not used his work phone. And so they didn't give us access to his personal phone because they said, well, that's the Premier's personal phone. So since then, myself and Global have been engaged in a years-long transparency battle with the government to try and get access to the Premier's cell phone, based on the argument that if he's not using his work phone at all, he must be using his personal phone for government business. And through that appeal, we've gone back and forth in front of the Information and Privacy Commissioner, who's the transparency watchdog who kind of adjudicates freedom of information requests. Gone back and forth in front of her, and through that process, the government has acknowledged that, yes, Doug Ford is using his personal cell phone for government work. He's also using it to run the PC party. He's using it to run caucus. He's using it for family things. Everything goes into that one device. And the government and then Doug Ford's lawyers subsequently have essentially said that while it might be true he's using his personal phone for work, it would be a massive invasion of his privacy and a completely impractical task to try and separate out which calls might relate to running the province versus which calls relate to running his household. You go back to about a year and a half ago, the Information and Privacy Commissioner, who is that transparency watchdog, they sided with Global News and with an Ontario doctor who's pursuing a very similar appeal to us, and found that Doug Ford was using his personal cell phone for work, and therefore that bits of it at least should be publishable and accessible to the media. The government then sought a judicial review of that order, tried to have an Ontario court throw it out and say that the Information and Privacy Commission had gone too far. That was heard at the end of December 2025. It took a panel of 3 judges less than 3 weeks, including the Christmas period, to throw out that attempt for a judicial review, and the government then said they would seek leave to appeal. That's sort of where these new changes come in, because what we've described so far in terms of exempting Cabinet and the Premier from freedom of information requests is also retroactive.
Yes.
So the government hasn't explicitly confirmed this, but it's very much our understanding that if these changes passed as they've been described, the government would effectively kill the court's decision by applying its law retroactively and saying, well, even if the Premier is using his personal cell phone for government business, it's not part of the freedom of information laws, and Global and any other journalist who wants access to it has no right to it.
Yeah, and this is, I think, in a column for our website, I described this as egregious, right? This is the tell, if you like, that it's one thing to change the law. It is quite another to make those changes retroactive. Constitutionally, the legislature has that power. We don't always have to like it. You did mention an Ontario doctor, and I do want to actually, because I think this has flown under the radar, but this is Dr. Brooks Fallis, who has alleged that he was denied a promotion or a position at an Ontario hospital because of his criticism of the Premier during COVID-19. He is trying to get access to the phone records to prove or disprove that allegation, as I understand it.
I think it's also interesting, right? Because it shows that it's not just journalists. This is a very real-world example of someone who believes, rightly or wrongly, they've not been proved right or wrong, but they believe that their employment opportunities were potentially frustrated by the Premier. They're using this publicly accessible tool to try and prove their allegation or not. So it really isn't just advocates in the media who use this. It is a tool that anyone is able to use.
And I will just add, this is a problem that the Premier has made for himself, because there is a reason why government officials are issued government phones to keep their personal and their public work separate. And if the Premier had, since 2018, been keeping these things separate, this would not be an issue. There have, of course, also been critics, and not just in the press corps. I'm going to just read a bit of a quote from the current Information and Privacy Commissioner, Patricia Same, who reacted very strongly to these proposed changes, saying, "Freedom of information laws exist to provide Ontarians with vital information about how government decisions are made, on what basis, who influenced them, and whether the public interest is being served." Issuing a very strong statement. It probably makes sense just to say that, mechanically what this law will do is make the Information and Privacy Commissioner less powerful. So she has a very direct stake in how that law is changed. Opposition parties, of course, have also criticized the government. I mean, what do we make of the idea that this law needed to be updated, though?
I think there's certainly some truth in it. I think that a law of that age does need to be updated in some way. I have a lot of sympathy, to be honest, for the idea that if I were a government minister or a staffer, I wouldn't want every text I've ever sent to be accessible to someone just because they're kind of fishing for something. I do have some sympathy for that argument, and I think the Information and Privacy Commissioner does as well. But I think she has suggested, so I interviewed her this week, and she sort of suggested that there were ways around this which involved maybe tidying up some of the shrapnel that comes out in just a digital world versus the important decision-making process, excluding some things that maybe are a little bit more mundane. I'll meet you around the corner for coffee. That kind of stuff doesn't need to be accessible to the public. The public doesn't learn a huge amount from that. But who was able to call the Premier? Who did the Minister of Health meet with? When did Michael Lindsay tell Kinga Surma that the Science Centre needed to be closed down? All of those things are much more key to understanding how our democracy works. And I think something else the Information and Privacy Commissioner has said this week is that she's not convinced by the argument that Ontario is coming in line with other provinces. She's suggesting that Ontario is essentially going a little further by excluding these communications from the Act altogether. So the way she explained it is that in other jurisdictions, or at least some of the jurisdictions she's looked at, a lot of these things, cabinet communications, for example, would be exempt from the Act, but they wouldn't be excluded. The difference is that an official in the civil service would still collect the document from you, but they would redact the whole thing and they wouldn't give it to the media or an advocate. Whereas what we have in Ontario, as I understand the rules proposed, is that you don't need to give that document to anyone. The Premier doesn't need to give his cell phone. The Minister of Health doesn't need to give her calendar to anyone in the civil service to look at at all. So the difference, which she says puts Ontario, in her words, offside with other jurisdictions, is that Ontario is keeping them out of the legislation altogether, whereas other places just stop them from being released. A minor difference, but one she sees as very important.
Right, and I think the importance there, if I can sort of draw that out a little bit, is if the data is at least being collected, there's at least a theoretical possibility that it might be accessible to the public. But if it's not being collected at all, if it's not being cataloged and organized, and all the things that we currently do with the Freedom of Information regime in Ontario, then it might as well just be shredded.
Yeah, and that goes to the historical keeping of records, right? She's also raised concerns about cybersecurity, right? If you're not using your government device and those sorts of things for these conversations, you're not necessarily giving them to civil servants, who knows what you're doing with them when you leave government, that raises all sorts of cybersecurity and security questions about decision-making documents as well.
Before we wrap up, I do want to say, I don't want to be a total sort of doomer on this topic. The public should obviously know that, information, it finds ways to get out. I think the old internet meme of information wants to be free. Legislative officers, the Auditor General, the Ombudsman, the Information and Privacy Commissioner, perhaps, they have ways of formally using their powers to make documents public. The government gets sued in court, and as part of those lawsuits, documents can be made public. Sometimes motivated public servants find ways to hand reporters documents in brown paper envelopes, and we always love when that happens. Information does find its way into the public realm. These proposed changes, if they go forward, they will make it harder. They will not stop reporters or anybody else from doing their job.
Yeah, and even on the freedom of information laws themselves, the way that we're looking at it, I think, is that 80% of what we currently get through freedom of information is probably going to remain the same. An awful lot of civil servants are frankly better at writing things down than politicians. Right. Civil servants have cleaner communication than politicians. They don't have reasons to pick up the phone instead of writing things down. So a lot of the information we find out does come through freedom of information requests to the civil service, which, as the government has said, are not changing. That bit doesn't change. I think what we're possibly losing, or what information will have to find its way out through other avenues, like you say, is the most explosive stuff. So it's generally the smallest portion of how we use freedom of information requests. But, to take the Premier's cell phone as an example, there's also cases of potentially using personal emails during the Greenbelt scandal. These kind of really high-profile elements that involve the big decision makers, that's the information that is going to be a little frustrated, that's going to have to find more creative ways of getting out to the public. But it's not, we should be clear, right? It's not like the government is killing the entire freedom of information system. They're just getting rid of the most explosive part.
Isaac Callan, Global News, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we go, you have a book coming out later this yeyear.
I do, although nothing to do with Ontario politics.
No, nothing at all to do with Ontario politics, but what is the book about? Tell our audience.
It's about the soccer team I grew up supporting, Hibernia. It's an Edinburgh soccer team, and my wife said I needed a hobby that wasn't work. So I found a way to write that was technically not work. It's coming out in May. It's called Hibernian Heroes, for anyone who wants to feel better about the Toronto Maple Leafs. They went 114 years without winning the Scottish Cup before my team won it in 2016. So if you think 1967 is bad, feel free to take a leaf through that.
Well, I'm sure there are somebody in our audience who is also interested in Scottish soccer, so they can find that book in bookstores in May. And once again, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I think it'd be fair to say that the Ford government signaled that they prioritize law and order and being tough on crime. No news there. And when the provincial government disagrees with a particular approach to an issue, sometimes the easiest way to effect change is simply to turn off the financial taps. That happened this week when the Premier announced he's cutting funding to supervised drug consumption sites again, which this government philosophically opposes. Okay, let's go through this. What happened here?
So this builds on changes that the government has been making now for more than a year, certainly. This started about 18 months ago when the government announced it was substantially restricting the number of supervised consumption sites in the province, particularly in the areas around public schools. The announcement this week will functionally, it seems, close the last remaining sites in the province that were still providing these services. There were 7 sites remaining, 2 each in Toronto and Ottawa, 1 in Niagara, Peterborough, and London, or 1 each in those cities. The province's explanation for this is that these communities now have operating HART hubs, that's HART, or homelessness and addiction recovery treatment hub. The creation of these HART hubs was part of what was announced 18 months ago. At the time, some supervised consumption sites were still permitted to stay open. The province is now closing that window. The end of provincial funding will come June 13th.
The government's position, and let's just put it on the record here, is that these sites were disruptive to the neighborhoods in which they found themselves, that there was open drug use happening, that there were used needles being left on the ground, that kind of thing. Researchers and advocates who think this is the way to go say otherwise. The shift in the HART hubs comes with some real money attached. It's $550 million so far, according to the government. So I guess we should ask the question now, is this going to help?
Well, this is, of course, the question, right? I mean, some advocates certainly do not believe that HART hub services have been adequate since they were announced. One outreach worker has said publicly that HART hubs are functionally not even operational in Toronto yet. Late last year, Toronto saw a spike in overdose calls for the city's EMS service, and advocates attributed that in press reporting. They attributed that spike in part to the closure of some supervised consumption sites. The research on this, I do want to say, is a bit mixed. Researchers have identified things like there was a closure of a supervised consumption site in Red Deer, Alberta, and so there's a case study around that closure that showed that there was, in fact, an increase in overdoses when that site closed. But there's a more recent systematic study that was funded by the federal government, though it's not a federal document in that sense, that found that it was very difficult to attribute what they call, population level changes in mortality, right? Like broad statistical increases in mortality.
So for the Premier, this tends to be a law and order issue. So while we are on that subject, let's continue on and talk about what pepper spray and bail hearings may have in common.
Yes, indeed. These are two items that are on the Premier's to-do list this week. And the thing they have in common is that they're not really straightforward things that the province can order itself. So we're going to start with the pepper spray. Attorney General Doug Downey wrote a letter to his federal counterpart, Sean Fraser, last week, urging the feds to legalize the use of pepper spray by private citizens for self-defense. We actually got a letter in the mailbag about this, and I'm going to just break our format for a second here. Hal Graham of Kingston, Ontario, wrote in to say that this idea, Hal's words, follows the American pattern that has proved corrosive to American society, this reliance on individual self-defense. I think Hal might also be alluding to American firearms laws in that context as well. And Hal asks, why would it work any better here? I think it's always a fair question to ask what Ontario can learn from other jurisdictions. And so it may not surprise you to learn that I went down a bit of a rabbit hole on pepper spray regulation.
I'm shocked, yes.
I am not going to read out the Wikipedia page that denotes all of the various forms of regulation for what is it called? Oleocapsaicin. But I will just say that it's not just the United States where pepper spray is legal for private citizens. It is legal in many jurisdictions, though, of course, not everywhere. The state of regulations I found very fascinating. There are places where it is regulated by age, where you don't let minors have it. Some places require a license and training. Other places do not. A wonderful tapestry of regulations with many different ideas. But the status quo in Canada right now is that pepper spray is a controlled, prohibited weapon. It is illegal for individuals to carry, with the exception of bear spray, which is still pepper spray, but it is intended specifically for warding off wildlife and obviously, as the name implies, bears. If you are carrying something labeled as bear spray and you are, as we are in this studio, very far away from dangerous wildlife, it is still a crime, and I would not advise you to do that.
I will take that as a compliment that you think you are far away from wildlife when you're doing this show.
You have your quirks, but you are not wildlife.
Reasonably civilized guy to sit across the table from, right?
I don't fear for my life here.
Good. How about bail hearings? What's going on with that?
Right. Bail hearings, and like the pepper spray issue, some of these changes that the government wants are probably going to require changes in federal legislation. The government is proposing to live stream bail hearings in Ontario. The Premier has said that he sees this as a means of holding judges accountable. The implication here, of course, being that judges have been releasing people on bail in unacceptable contexts and that the public has a right to know about these decisions. We already discussed freedom of information law with Isaac earlier. I'm going to just put my cards on the table here. As a journalist, I support transparency in the court system in much the same way that I support transparency in all areas of the Ontario government. There are a few hiccups here, though. While the province administers the courts, it's the criminal code that dictates a lot of the processes. And in this case, the criminal code allows for publication bans that cover most of the information that would be disclosed in a bail hearing. So the province can install these cameras, it can train people on their operation, but judges and lawyers, and particularly the lawyers of defendants, are going to have some ability to simply turn off these live streams, even if the cameras are on. I'm certain that some bail hearings will, in fact, end up being live streamed because of these changes if they go forward, but it's going to be less than what the Premier wants.
In that case, let's get out of here. Off to issue 3. We have focused our attention on the municipal scene a few times lately because this is, of course, a municipal election year in Ontario, and so things are heating up at the level of government closest to the people. While there are 444 municipalities across the province and races, I think, pretty much in every single one of them, understandably, the race for mayor in the capital city gobbles up a disproportionate amount of attention, in part because Toronto is the country's biggest city, and in part because the personalities kicking the tires on this race are so well known. JMM, interestingly enough, the current mayor of the capital city has not indicated yet for sure whether she will run again. Spoiler alert. Of course she's running again, but she hasn't said so yet. But there are plenty of other reasons to pay attention to this race anyway.
Yes.
Fire away.
So the biggest change in the last few weeks was the announcement by John Tory that he will not make an attempt to return to the mayor's office. But John Tory has a constituency of people who would like to see a conservative challenger to Olivia Chow, and not all of them love the idea of Brad Bradford, who I think at the moment is the most prominent conservative challenger to Olivia Chow. And so they've gone casting.
He's on city council right now,
Yes,
for those living outside the
Currently
city.
the councillor for Beaches East York. And so they went casting about. They went shopping for potential other candidates, one of whom was Rod Phillips, a colleague of John Tory's. And I would say, I think you could fairly say they are like-minded men.
Former finance minister?
Former finance minister, of course. Phillips very quickly put out a statement saying that thanks, but no thanks. We've mentioned Brad Bradford. And then Michael Ford's name started popping up. As we say, conservative backers in the city looking for somebody to put in the competition. Michael Ford, of course, he was a school board trustee. He was a city councillor. He was an MPP. He was a cabinet minister under Doug Ford's government. And then he left provincial politics. I don't mean to be unkind, but I think it's fair to say he did not have like the most distinguished career in provincial politics. But he rose to the level of minister, so prominent, and of course he has the Ford family name, which helps. People are clearly trying to figure out how this horse race is all going to shake out, and I do have to mention I actually got polled. I'm one of those people who still has a landline, so I still get opinion polls, and
do you do them?
Yeah, I always want to know what questions they're asking, and so
Because the first thing they say is, if you're a member of the media or you're a member of a political party or something like that.
Oh, this was just a robot.
Oh, this was a robocall. Okay.
If I get an actual human, honesty compels me to say, like, I'm happy to answer your poll, but I am a member of the media, and then they usually say, oh, thanks for nothing, bye.
Yeah.
In this case, it was clearly some. I'll use the words fly-by-night operation. It was not an established pollster that I recognized, let me put it that way. Or if it was, they weren't using their real name. But they did poll Olivia Chow, Brad Bradford, and Michael Ford. And they specifically asked whether the respondent saw Michael Ford's association with Doug Ford as a plus or a negative. I think it's interesting that the question is being asked because people are clearly trying to suss out what Michael Ford's strengths and weaknesses are.
Now, the math of a race that Michael Ford gets into gets complicated because, of course, Olivia Chow has sort of the center-left lane all to herself. And if Michael Ford jumps in and Brad Bradford's already in, then the center-right vote gets divided between the two of them.
Yes.
That theoretically makes it easier for Olivia Chow to win. We'll see how that unfolds. Now, lest we be accused of focusing inordinately on the capital city, we should, as we said at the outset, note that there are lots of other municipalities in the province where they're going to have some decent races. And what else you want to tell us?
We're going to do a bit of a lightning round through some other municipalities here. We're going to start with Guelph, where Mayor Cam Guthrie, who has won 3 times in 2014, 2018, and 2022, has opted not to run for a 4th term in the mayor's office. Now, a 3-time mayor of a big city choosing not to run again, that would be notable on its own, and I'm sure we wish him well in his future endeavors. But there is a provincial political angle that I thought I would explore. Steve, remind us all, who is the MPP for Guelph?
I'm pretty sure that's the leader of the Green Party, Mike Schreiner.
Yes, indeed. And despite being the leader of the Green Party, people keep asking him whether he's interested in other jobs. Most notoriously, that incident where some prominent Liberals invited him to run for the leadership of their party. So I thought to myself, hey, I wonder if Mike is interested in being the mayor of Guelph. So I asked.
You're being very mischievous today, aren't you?
Yeah, I thought I would have some fun with it. But no, Mike Schreiner is a no on the Guelph mayor's race. He says that he is grateful for Mayor Guthrie's years of public service and, quote, there is still a lot of work to be done to make our province a better place to live, and remaining the leader of the Ontario Greens is the best way I can make a difference. So I am not much of a political troublemaker.
But I will say, nice try.
It was worth a shot,
It
right?
was indeed. Okay, let's keep going. Niagara region, what's going on?
Right. So a short addendum to this story because we have discussed it a few times in the last few weeks. But despite the resignation of the Niagara Region Chair Bob Gale, the Premier reiterated this week that his government is going to, in his words, streamline operations at Niagara Region. When we last discussed this, I had left the question open as to whether Gale's resignation would take the steam out of this issue. It did not. Premier Ford has a bee in his bonnet about the fact that Niagara Region has more local elected representatives than the Ontario legislature does. He says that the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Rob Flack, will be bringing forward legislation in the spring sitting, which, of course, begins next week.
Now, that is a bit of a different position for the Premier because, of course, up until now, he always said any legislative changes to representation in Niagara Region have to start with the municipality itself. We are not going to lead that process. Sounds like he's changed his mind on that.
Yeah, again, at the press conference where he also talked about shooting home invaders, he mentioned that he was looking for support from the local mayors, and then I think the phrase he used was like the moment they got any kind of criticism, they all melted like chocolate or something. And
Chocolate soldiers, they melt when the sun comes out.
yes, and I'm trying not to be sort of overly cynical about this, but there are times where there are genuine local issues that bubble up into the provincial state of affairs, and the Premier says, "Oh, well, here's there's a local issue. We'll have our government address it." And then there are other times where it's actually coming from the province, but they want the perception that they're addressing a local priority. And I guess just to put it bluntly, I think the events of the last few weeks have told us what is actually happening here.
He's not wrong on the math, though. If you think about it, there are 124 MPPs for 16 million Ontarians.
Yes.
And there are 126 local councillors,
Mayors,
officials,
councillors,
etc., for Niagara Region for 500,000 people. So that's a lot of representation if you compare it to the Ontario legislature. Okay, can I do one more here?
Yes,
I
absolutely.
want to get a shout out in for my hometown of Hamilton, which has, I would suggest, the best mayor's race anywhere in the province happening. And just a little background here, of course, former Ontario NDP leader Andrea Horwath. She lost the election in 2022 to Doug Ford, and then just a few months later decided to run for mayor of Hamilton, and she won. She defeated a guy, sort of more on the business side of things, named Keenan Loomis, but it was close. 135,000 roughly votes cast, and she won by 1,663. So 1%. It was a really tight race. Guess what's happening this fall?
Rematch?
Rematch. You got it. Yes, they are going again. It'll be Horwath versus Loomis, but with a little extra flourish here because a third candidate is now capturing attention too. Hamilton City Councillor Rob Cooper. He's also in, and Mr. Cooper, I've never met him, but he's got a hell of a resume. He's got, just tons of experience all over the place. He's been endorsed by former Mayor Bob Bratina, who also ran last time and came third. It might be the best mayor's race in the entire province of Ontario. You got three high-profile, talented, experienced people who are going to go at it, and I'm going to keep my eye on that one. That's for darn sure.
I'm sure it will come up again in the podcast.
Amen. And with that, it's off to your column, my column. Time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns that we wrote for TVO.org this past week. Start us off, sir.
Right. So I wrote about a recent report from the Institute on Research and Public Policy about the economic difficulties and potential for Sault Ste. Marie. This is, to me, is such an interesting city because you've got, the single largest private employer, the Algoma steel mill there has historically been very troubled, has gone through many cycles of ownership. And so the question for both local and provincial and federal governments is, how do you protect a community like Sault Ste. Marie when it is clearly exposed to, among other things, the whims of a U.S. government that has suddenly decided it doesn't want Canadian steel, right? The province and, frankly, not even the federal government can change the direction of the global steel industry, right? There are some things that the province could do. One of the perennial complaints in local Sault Ste. Marie politics is that while Ontario Lottery and Gaming, OLG, is headquartered in Sault Ste. Marie and has been for many years, while there was a big to-do when they moved the headquarters there, over time, a lot of those jobs have had this tendency to migrate back to Toronto. And I think at this point, it's something like 50-50 or even fewer jobs are actually in Sault Ste. Marie. And so Mayor Matthew Shoemaker, among many others, has said, like, one of the easiest things the province could do for us is make the headquarters actually be the headquarters and move some of those jobs back to Sault Ste. Marie. And then, of course, there's issues about like the local college, the local university. They have suffered because of the changes to both provincial and federal post-secondary policy. So, all of these things come together. But I think the real message in the report is that, more than any one policy that, could potentially help out Sault Ste. Marie, what we really need is better coordination amongst the three levels of government. And so my column just goes into a bit of that and a bit of what that might look like.
Sault Ste. Marie is a great community. I've been there many, many times. People there
on my list. I've never been.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'll tell you, the people are wonderful. If you love the outdoors, cross-country skiing, downhill skiing, whatever it is you like, it's very close, obviously, to the border with the United States if you want to go into the U.S. It's a great place. But you're quite right. Many of those jobs have migrated back to Toronto, and it's an issue again. So there we go. Okay, can I talk about the gift that keeps on giving?
Yes.
I do admit that I am somewhat fascinated with this by-election that's happening in Scarborough, and I'll just do a quick background check here. Bill Blair was the MP for Scarborough Southwest. He got appointed to go over to the United Kingdom, represent Canada over there. That opened up a seat. The deputy leader of the Ontario NDP, Dolly Begum, got poached by Mark Carney's government to sort of flipped to the Liberals, and she got appointed to be the candidate for the federal by-election. But that, of course, opens up a seat at Queen's Park. Same riding, Scarborough Southwest, and it's now an open seat, and the Liberals have decided they're not going to appoint anybody provincially. They're going to have an open nomination. And Nate Erskine-Smith, who I think is your member of parliament,
yes, he's
in the Beaches East York.
Beaches East York.
He has been there for, I think, 11 years. And he has been very open in saying, look, I want to, it's right next door, right? Scarborough Southwest is right next to Beaches East York. I want to go plant my flag there. I want to win the nomination. I want to win the by-election. And I want to parlay that into a run for the leadership of the Ontario Liberals, which is vacant right now. Yes. And, come on, people, get on board. This is something that can start in Scarborough Southwest and then take on province-wide implications. So, he's obviously trying to make that case to people. There are several other candidates in the race who are not taking kindly to that suggestion. Kadira Jackson, for example, was the 2025 candidate. She was actually very unhappy with Mr. Erskine-Smith because apparently there is sort of a courtesy in politics that when you decide you're going to get into a race, the candidate of record, meaning the person who ran there last time, if they intend to run again, and she always did, it's sort of courteous to give them a call and say, hey, Kadira, Nate here. I know you ran last time, but, circumstances have changed. I'd really like to run this time, and I just want to let you know I'm in the race, and, let's do what we can to have a good contest and then unite after it's all over.
Yes.
He did not make that call for a month after announcing his intention to get in. So Kadira Jackson's nose was a little bit out of joint on that, particularly since she's from the area, she's raising her kids in the area, she's a lawyer, got lots of community ties, and she figures, well, not only does she think she's the better candidate, but she says people in the area don't want Nate Erskine-Smith in the race because he's from over there and I'm from here. Erskine-Smith says, just because I'm from the other side of Victoria Park, which is the street, basically, the dividing line.
Divides the two ridings, yes.
Yeah, hardly means I'm an outsider.
Yes.
Ahsanul Hafiz is another person who wants to run. He came to Canada 16 years ago as an international student and through dint of hard work managed to go from being a pizza delivery boy to a guy who now owns 30 Domino's Pizza locations, a couple in Quebec as well. He signed up 3,500 members. He thinks he's the guy to beat. He had a rather testy exchange with Erskine-Smith as well on the issue of, why don't you just drop out and join my campaign? He says, no, I really want to run. But he lives in London. He lives in London, Ontario, but he's seeking this open seat in Scarborough Southwest. So this gets complicated. Mahmouda Nasreen is another candidate. She's an immigration consultant, also from the Bengali community, as Mr. Hafiz is. She figures she signed up 500 people. This is just going to be an old-fashioned humdinger, right? Because you got a bunch of people, all of whom want the same thing, all of whom have very legitimate claims to being the best possible challenger to whoever the other parties put up. Sizable Bengali community there. We have 2 Bengali candidates in the race. No date set yet for the Liberal nomination meeting. No date set for the by-election. But I got a feeling we ain't heard the last of Scarborough Southwest.
Yeah, so the other thing, assuming that Nate Erskine-Smith does, in fact, become the Liberal candidate, and when a by-election is called, in order to be eligible to run provincially, Erskine-Smith has to resign his federal seat, not to become the Liberal candidate, but if he wants to register when the by-election is called, he has to resign. So that will then create a further vacancy.
That'll create a by-election federally in Beaches, East York.
And there was a poll out this week from Main Street that suggested that this could actually be a seat that the NDP could flip if Avi Lewis wins that party's leadership and were to run in Beaches, East York. This is a federal seat that the NDP held before Erskine-Smith won it in 2015 and held it for the Liberals since. But it's very much a seat that has gone back and forward between the Liberals and the NDP, certainly since I've lived there. And so just one more wheel to add to all the machinery that is turning right now.
Follow the bouncing ball, folks. You never know where it's going to stop. Now, we've gone on so long here, we're not going to get to the mailbag this week. We'll come back to that next week. But you want to give the email address just in case people want to chime in?
Yes, absolutely. People can always email us questions or comments. They can send it to onpolitics@tvo.org.
Terrific. And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, March the 20th, 2026. A heads up, next week we'll still be on television for our usual 8 p.m. time slot, but our audio podcast will drop a little later than normal because it's Ontario Budget Week, and we want to take some extra time to give you real in-depth coverage. And of course, Finance Minister Peter Bethlen-Falvey will be our special guest here on the program.
You can follow our show wherever you get your podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please include your first and last name and where you're from.
This week's episode was produced by Tiff Lamb, editing by David Irwin.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Laurie Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
We always, at this point, like to thank our crew for setting up the thing here. And in particular this week, Mark Ford has been keeping the trains running on time here from a technical point of view for 35 years.
Wow.
And he's having, we're having later this week one of these little, what do they call it? Service awards ceremonies for him. So Mark, I can meet you on camera one if you like. Mark, thank you for everything you do to keep this place running. You are, what does the Premier say? You are a champion, my friend. You are a champion. 35 years, and you've only just got started. So keep coming back. I wish you were in the control room to hear this, but anyway, whatever. Until next Friday, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.